I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and welcome to our last summer virtual seminar series featuring Kayla Smith, Karin Limburg, and Andrea Feldposh Parker. Sorry, I hope I did that well.
You're close.
From SUNY ESF up at Syracuse, New York. We'll be talking about public perceptions of dam removal in the Hudson-Mohawk Watershed. And for those of you who, let's see. For those of you who have missed the previous seminars, they're on our website. Today is the one on that Kayla Smith will be presenting, and if you go to our website for the our website for the seminars, you'll see the recordings of the previous seminars given by Dr. Scott Steinschneider, Dr. Jace Bernhardt, and the first one by Dr. Chris Gobler. And this one will be available as well on our website, as well as our YouTube channel. Also, I'd like to remind everybody that after this seminar is over, I invite you to go to the link that I'll post into the chat to fill out this survey on the seminar. It's very useful if you fill this out, because we use the results from this survey to plan for the seminars that we'll be doing in the future. We'll be having another series of seminars in 2021. So it'll be useful for you to fill that out, and I'll put the link in the chat during and after the seminar. So I'll stop the share on that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Andrea. Andrea is going to introduce Kayla, and then Kayla will begin her presentation. So Andrea, you're up.
Actually, if Karin might, if Karin would mind doing it, I just want to, my internet connection's a little funky, so I want to.
All right.
Make sure it comes through.
Karin can do it
Karin,
as well. Karin Limburg, the other.
I had a little confab about that. So yeah, it's a pleasure to introduce Kayla Smith. Kayla is I think a 4th+ year, maybe PhD student. So she's an advanced PhD student working with Andrea and myself up here at SUNY ESF. And Kayla has a background in fisheries biology from, what is it called? New England, you'll have to remind me, UNE, right? University of New England.
Yes.
And so with that sort of training, though, she wanted to actually sort of bridge over from the kind of just the hard, not really hardcore, but, somewhat hardcore fishery science kinds of research into research that really engages with people much more. And so she's actually made this leap into sort of bridging across from natural science to social science. And she recruited 2 of us, Andrea being an environmental communication scientist and myself being kind of a fisheries ecologist, I guess. And so it's been a real pleasure working with her, because she's been teaching us things too. This project was funded by, in large part by New York Sea Grant got it started, and then also by the Water Resources Institute, and I'm not sure if anybody else has funded it too, but anyway, this is really, we all think that this is a very important topic to try to understand how people perceive dam removal, because it's not going to happen unless there's public will. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Kayla.
Thank you so much, Karin, for the introduction. Can everyone hear me all right? I want to make sure my microphone is good.
You sound good, Kayla.
Thank you, Lane. So I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So the research that I am doing, let's see, next, is in the Hudson River watershed and the Upper Mohawk watershed. So the Hudson River is obviously an extremely important watershed along the East Coast. The Hudson River estuary is the tidally influenced portion of the Hudson River watershed, and the federal dam allows that area to be influenced by tides. The Hudson watershed has more than 90 tributaries that flow into the main stem of the Hudson, and the Mohawk River is one of those largest tributaries as well. So today we're going to be talking about dam removal and dams that are old and derelict within the Hudson River watershed. Those are the focus of this talk. So there are many barriers on these Hudson River tributaries that block the passage of migratory fishes and other aquatic organisms. So here's just a progression of dam building over time in the Hudson watershed. And these are just dams that are currently on an inventory list. So there are many more that aren't on these lists, are nationally registered, as well as culverts, where there's not really a good estimation of how many of those there are. And they also serve as a barrier for aquatic organisms in the Hudson. So history of dam building in the US. Most dams in the Northeast were built to meet the needs for power and navigation during the Industrial Revolution. Across the US, dams are also used for many other purposes, such as recreational, for drinking water reservoirs, for flood control, and many things like that. Particularly in the Hudson, a lot of these dams started as mill dams. They were made of various different types of materials. And from that, some of them have been, the framework of them has been used to make hydropower dams, and many of them currently no longer serve a purpose and are just sitting there vacant on our tributaries. So there are many things about the natural environment that these man-made structures impacts. So here's an image here of a dam. Downstream, you can see in the picture, it's extremely dewatered. The sediment is pretty mobile or not there at all. And then above the dam, you have these impoundments where lots of sediments and things accumulate. So with this natural flow of water being blocked, this impacts water quality. You'll have reservoirs that become entirely too warm in summer months. And this entire change in the regime of these tributaries changes what is able to grow there, from plants to the colonization from non-native species that can be very favorable for that. And then what I want to talk about today, stopping the migration of our heritage migratory fish species. So across the East Coast, there's been many efforts to try and remove dams across different states. However, New York is generally far behind in comparison with some of these river restoration efforts. However, we do have so many great environmental organizations that are committed to the stewardship of this watershed itself. So how can we better operationalize dam removal projects and sort of get things going more than they already have been in the past? So for restoring migratory fish species, dam removal is extremely important. And some migratory fish species, also called diagamous, in the Hudson include this suite of 11 species here. Some of them may be familiar to you, some may not. So we have our American shad, striped bass, and sturgeon. Those are some of the more charismatic fishes. Unfortunately, our rainbow smelt, I just grayed that out, has been moved more northern due to climate change. However, for the purposes of thinking about dam removal and early colonizers of rivers that are now restored, river herring and American eel are those sentient species. So they're able to enter these tributaries immediately after a dam is removed and help restore those river to sea connections. So river herring are alewife and blueback herring, very conspecific species, and the American eel. So these migratory fishes have a life cycle similar to like a salmon. So they need to enter both freshwaters and oceans to reproduce or to go through their whole life cycle. So river herring have the salmon life cycle in which they spend the majority of their lives in the ocean, and the American eel actually do the opposite. They enter rivers and live there and mature and can live to extremely old ages, and their juveniles actually are reared in the ocean and then come back to tributaries in the spring. So why should we care about these migratory fishes if you're not a fish biologist? So over time, these species have served strong economic and cultural values to river and coastal communities. They have these seasonal spawning runs, which has made them a dependable protein source over time for not only humans, but also for our various predators, both in rivers and in oceans. So they serve a large role in food web dynamics. However, their population status currently is extremely threatened and many are federally listed. So here we're going to be looking at the Northwest Atlantic Ocean, and I'm going to be putting up a graph of abundance over time. So here on the y-axis, we have abundance, a proxy for that. And on the x-axis, we have a time series here. And these are those 11 heritage species. But I want to focus on for the rest of the talk are these alewife, blueback herring, and American eel. You can see these severe population declines. So there's many reasons why these populations are disappearing in our river systems. Of most significant impact are this loss of habitat due to dams. If they can't colonize rivers or can't leave them safely, their populations are not going to survive. But there's many other factors that play into this as well, including overharvest. So this is an image here of larval eels. So these are called glass eels. They're harvested from river systems, sent over to Asian countries, where they're raised to adults, and then we consume them as sushi. And also there are river herring are subject to a lot of bycatch as well. So that means they're incidentally caught when other fish species are being harvested. So one way in order to look at this dam removal and their impact in restoring these fishes and what we've seen here in New York is how these initiatives have been relatively slow. That's how we started this project. We wanted to see what sort of systems are at play in triggering this action or inaction of these different projects. And there's many stakeholders involved and lots of really great state agency members that are working their hardest, but there's something that's not quite clicking. So let's start at the beginning and assess attitudes towards river restoration in general, and also sort of get a feeling of what people feel about these fishes to begin with, because they are so separated from them. Another research question was to build on thinking about public participation and using a practice called systems mapping and mediated modeling to try and better understand the different systems that are at play between social communities as well as the ecosystem as a whole. And then we can get a better understanding of what topics people are really considering when they're thinking about a specific dam removal project and how many of these could be similar within the Hudson or how they may differ. So I mentioned systems. So I am approaching this project and thinking about social ecological systems. So what this means is we have the ecological system that we care about, our fishes all the way up to the habitat that they need. And then on the other hand, we have our social systems. So this is where I'm incorporating social science methodology to try and partake what connections exist within the restoration network in the Hudson and how that may be being impacted by different organizations and also like public stakeholders getting involved in these processes. So we have these two separate systems, however, they do interact, and that occurs over various scales, and it can get really complicated. So when I first thought of systems mapping, I thought of an image like this, which incorporates all of the considerations that may be at play in restoring these fishes. However, this diagram is horrendous. And right here in the middle, I want you to focus on where it says human and ecological well-being. And then to the right of it, this says salmon health, but let's change that to river herring health. So that's really what's at the core of this problem here. So how can we take this horrendous, complex diagram of these social ecological interactions and boil it down to, what's really happening here in the Hudson and, make it more digestible. So in order to investigate that a little bit more, I'm using systems thinking theory from the social sciences, in particular, what's called environmental communication. So that's how people communicate about environmental issues, specifically conflicts such as dam removal. So there's different theories that go along with this communication strategy and how we as individuals sort of speak about environmental issues in these different, what we call frames. So they include economic considerations, educational, science, all different things like that. So in recent years, this has been used to look at the adaptation and application of different technologies, particularly energy. So there's more defined systems that can be used to look at how people are discussing environmental conflict that are listed here. So we are approaching using this theory in that dam removal is a technology. So we can further refine that theory and how we can sort of look at what are some risks and uncertainties that people are mentioning in terms of economic impacts of dam removal, and further define that for thinking about dam removal and fish restoration. And my co-advisor, Andrea, came up with this little acronym, SPAWNS. So the socio-political and watershed denaturalization systems. And this is a framework in which we are using our public discourse, qualitative rich data, and looking at it in terms of these systems and looking at risks and benefits to dam removal in the Hudson. And then we're able to take that qualitative data and turn it into more quantitative metrics to try and determine which are the main factors at play here. So in order to look at regional differences within the Hudson and how people's attitudes about dam removal may vary, we chose 3 study sites all the way up in the Mohawk Watershed, the Quassaick Creek, the Winants Kill, which kill is another name for creek, and the Quassaick Creek. So I'm going to go through briefly some history of these sites and then our methods on the ground and how we collected our qualitative information. So the Quassaick Creek is part of the Mohawk Watershed, and the Mohawk has a long history of being important for migratory fishes. Particularly, we found evidence of eel weirs that were used here in the late 18th century in order to capture eels, and you can actually see them in that image there. So this was an extremely important connection between different river systems in New York. And currently, what's really fascinating is that the Mohawk Watershed, it's extremely engineered in that it has locks. So these locks separate the river into different segments, and they're used to help boats navigate throughout the river. However, our river herring, these very charismatic little fishes, have been able to figure out how to get into these little locks that act like elevators, and they will ride the locks through the Mohawk River from the Hudson. And this has proved to be a really important spawning ground and another alternative habitat for these fishes. So we definitely wanted to explore that. So next we're going downstream to the Winans-Gill. This area was used, it's a pretty short creek. However, it had a barrier at the mouth of it, and it was extremely dammed, even being like 14 miles long. It had like a series of 6 dams on it. So it meets the Hudson River at Troy. The Burden Ironworks Museum was gracious enough to have us come and do one of our workshops there. They had a lot of rich history and pictures of how this river had been harnessed to use to provide manufacturing for this economy back in the day. And there's an image of what the creek looks like right now. There's still that legacy of that past industry, very prominent. Right before our study started, there was a dam removal at the mouth of this creek, which was really exciting. And it was picked up very largely in the media. And they focused on how these river herring were able to use the tributary for the first time in 85 years. So maybe we were onto something when thinking about how we should connect the fish habitat restoration potential and see how the public, feels about that in terms of getting these restoration efforts to go forward. And then our final site was the Quassaick Creek. This is a site that the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation uses to collect and monitor glass eels, which are those baby eels. And they do this through a citizen science monitoring program. So there's a large connection here to the community as a whole. However, the area is extremely urban and it's relatively short, although it has this past, again, history of being milled, having mill dams. However, the creek itself, a lot of the land around it is publicly owned, so that has a good opportunity for restoration activities here. So sort of some methods that we went through with this Sea Grant project is that we used a series of public participation events with increasing engagement strategies in it. So what we did first is we went to these sites and we held a lecture and a field trip in which we were able to go out and electroshock for these eels and herring to see if they were actually in the tributaries themselves. And then we gave a lecture about the ecology and the history of the tributary and hosted a little discussion with that. And then in our final workshop series, we put together this thing called a mediated modeling activity that I'll walk you through, in which we actually invited stakeholders to come and investigate all these different systems like through a computer model and see how the conversation would change from that. And then we collected lots of data from pre and post surveys and then focus groups, which I'll be presenting later on. So here are some images of our first workshop series, this lecture. This is a picture in this Burden Ironworks Museum, which was super fascinating to be surrounded by the history as well as talking about it with stakeholders. It was really wonderful. And then we were able to go right outside into the stream and have a lot of volunteers help us with this electroshocking and sort of, see, it's one thing to talk about the fish, but it's another thing to actually see them in person. And that was proved to be a very engaging part of this work. And then for our second phase of the workshop, so this is building on participation and getting stakeholders engaged, we did something called mediated modeling. So this is an extension of systems mapping. So this is taking into account all the different factors that stakeholders identified in previous workshops as being important to dam removal. and then trying to form connections between them. What are the relationships? Are they positive? Are they negative? And I was able to take some of this information before the workshop and put together a model and a modeling program called Stella, and then make a little user interface that stakeholders were able to go through and to look at graphs and things that came out from that. I also encouraged the stakeholders who attended to look at a conceptual model. Instead of pulling up the whole model that was really messy, I showed them this simplified version and said, this is what I've made based on our past workshops and data that we collected. Does this seem accurate? What else would you add to this? Do you think these relationships are positive or negative? So because our goal here is to increase the number of returning fish and restore these populations, but maybe that's not our goal based on everyone who came to the workshops. So this is what that little interface looked like, and you could click through and go through that. And I was able to have people sit in groups and discuss and have this really rich conversation at these like larger and smaller levels. And we recorded all that information, and I'm currently analyzing that now a little bit further. Okay, so from our focus group data that I collected, I was able to use a program to look at the spawns categories and look at risks and benefits within that rich text. So I was able to highlight sections of the text that fit into those categories. And then the program gives you a percentage by which all of that contributes to the overall conversation. And then I'll present that information later on. Okay, so here is an image of, I'm going to show a graph of a pre-workshop prior knowledge. So I asked folks that came to the workshops what their prior knowledge of these different aspects of dam removal were. And I do want to note that our attendance definitely varied between all of our workshops, and we definitely had issues with recruiting in the Mohawk River. So this is something that for future work in these areas would be really important to explore further. So here, what I want you to look at are the differences in color. So there was much more knowledge in the Quassaick Creek of the migratory fishes, particularly because of that citizen science program. And in the Wynantskill, we were able to have stakeholders that were more knowledgeable about stream flow and watershed restoration as a whole, and less knowledgeable about the fish, which is interesting. So now I'm going to show data from our focus groups. And on the x-axis here, I have both of our watershed communities that we went to and did this lecture and field trip exercise with. And I have all these spawn system categories will be in different colors. And I separated that out by benefits or risks and uncertainty. So a benefit was if they talked positively about that factor, and the risk uncertainty would be, that hesitancy, this has been an issue in the past. On the y-axis, we have that percentage of that occurring within the text of the focus group conversations. So what you can see is that overall it was pretty mixed between both communities, but there were some differences. However, I want you to pay attention to that burnt orange color. It says ecological. So we had these workshops, and the focus of it was, how can we restore these fisheries, these fish populations through dam removal? However, we spent the majority of the time talking about all these other systems that weren't about the fish. And I think that's where the conflict is really happening in the Hudson. So within that ecological section, a lot of the discussions were positive generally. People, right here I have a quote, "So many people don't realize that the river is alive." and having the opportunity to get in and participate in like citizen science and monitoring these glass eels was a great way to get people engaged, and they echoed that in our workshops. In terms of fisheries restoration, I have a couple more quotes that I want to show. When you start realizing what was here, it just adds a lot of fun to what you're seeing or trying to visualize. What it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago, and how that could be challenging for people. This alludes to this idea of shifting baselines in the ecological literature and how people's perceptions change over time because they get more disconnected from resources. And then here's another quote. There is a skewed representation of historical importance. Oh, it's a mill dam, so it's historic. I want to keep the whole thing there. So we encounter this a lot. People wanted to keep the charm of the mill dam site, and that's really important. Cultural heritage is important within New York. However, this participant said, I think a fish run that has been going on for a couple thousand years is also pretty historic. So definitely something to think about. Again, these aesthetic and cultural values. Maybe there's an opportunity to restore the ecology of these stream systems, but also celebrate the history and what has been there, because history is really interesting and crucial to this community. And especially in the Quassaick Creek, we found this to be true, in that we had a stakeholder group that, envisioned what this creek could look like if it was restored. And they saw a walkway that could be there. They described placards that could be put up that showed the history. And, this can be a free-flowing creek again. So next I want to show some data from the mediated modeling exercise. So this was that technical workshop with stakeholders where they were going through the computer model simulations, and we had a focus group right before that one. So you're seeing the exact same structure of the graph as I showed before. But I want to point to the differences between benefits and risks and uncertainties. So from hosting this mediated modeling workshop, we were able to have more technical stakeholders come and participate. And with this, they were more likely to highlight risks and uncertainties because they have more expertise in the actual dam removal projects and efforts. So it showed the benefit of not only having our field trip and lecture workshops, but as well as this more technical mediated modeling workshop. We got a lot of diversity in our public perception data, which was excellent. So here we had a private dam owner attend the event and shared images of the dam that they own, as well as a video of eels trying to ascend that structure as well, which was extremely engaging. And with this, we talked a lot of those risks and uncertainties about technical challenges. And I thought this quote really highlighted some of the practitioner-wise issues on the ground with dam removal in the Hudson. And, asking, we could get some success stories. If you can improve the habitat for organisms, we could help the state. So those are the folks that are executing these projects on the ground. The permitting folks need help going through projects in order to know how to simplify it as much as possible. And they don't get the opportunity to do that very often because there are not very many dams to remove. That's kind of a negative feedback loop in a lot of ways. So we had stakeholders using these systems, terminology, which was excellent, and also identifying, pathways forward. They said there's not very many dams to remove because outreach to private dam owners is a challenge. The majority of these small abandoned dams are privately owned. So owners need to be involved in these processes. So these workshops are great. We learned so much information. However, we talked about dam removal, but then we talked about not removing the dams. And the conversation definitely veered off, especially in our mediated modeling workshop. We were talking about dams that currently serve no purpose. And it was suggested that, you know, perhaps they can serve a purpose now. We should leave them there. We shouldn't just remove them right away. Maybe we can install new technologies. And one of those new technologies would be micro hydropower. So here's an image here on the right of what micro hydropower looks like. It's just retrofitting or installing a small turbine onto an existing dam site, which can provide local microgrid power for a lot of communities that feel like they want to produce electricity and give back to the grid, such as solar panels and things like that. So it's all in that realm. So my co-advisor, Andrea, is she has a lot of expertise in these energy technologies. And we started thinking about this a little bit more. And I'm currently applying some of this research with a group of multidisciplinary communication scholars and thinking about the science of stakeholder engagement and how we didn't expect to talk about micro hydropower at all. And this now complex problem seems like a riddle and even more complicated. And I've chosen this analogy here of the farmer's dilemma. How can we cross the river when we have all these different systems and even more that interact in various ways, some negative, some positive? And how can we reach a medium in meeting everyone's needs? So I'm calling this crossing the river of restoration when the default is inaction. So that means not executing these projects and letting these systems collide. So how can we better explore and articulate these extra system elements and anticipate when these conversations might come up? Also, the unexpected interactions there. If a reservoir of a dam is being used for irrigation purposes for local agricultural fields, that's a problem that needs to be considered at the onset of these dam removal projects. So applying this now, and then these systems are going to be different for every dam removal project as well. So finally, take-home points. Overall, from all the focus groups, there was a lot of these risks and uncertainties that were mentioned. However, there was a lot of interconnections as well. And thinking about communication theory, we call that resonance. So looking at these system risks, what do successful policy interventions look like? And how can outreach to private dam owners go smoother? And is there a way to capture the voices that we weren't really able to based on our recruitment efforts? Along with this, we had this goal migration in our focus groups, where the goal to restore fish wasn't actually talked about. And we focused most of our time on thinking about these other social systems at play. So with finishing up my dissertation, I'm so thankful to New York Sea Grant for funding this work. I'm now able to finish up my dissertation, and I have so many more questions. One of my chapters will be at looking at more efficient ways to approach dam removal in New York by looking at states all across the US, coastal states, and seeing how their projects are being executed. Another question that I had is, do stakeholders care more about dams than fish right now? And because that's what our research was alluding to. So how can we make this diatomaceous migratory fish conservation matter? And is there a way to do that through ecosystem services? So ecosystem services are benefits from the environment that humans obtain. So one example of that would be if our fish populations were restored in these river systems and there was a fishery that could be opened again, what can be harvested from that in terms of biomass? So that means we can actually measure that, the pounds of fish that would be landed. That's an ecosystem service. So now I have all this rich information about these spawn codes categories and the percentages by which all of these were talked about. So I can go through and say, within the aesthetic and cultural category, environmental education was an ecosystem service that was mentioned, citizen science. And that is a type of cultural ecosystem service. So from that, I can look at regional differences as well. So this graph on the bottom here are results from one of the Quassaick workshop focus groups. So now what I've done is gone ahead and mapped all those ecosystem services. So in the orange here, you see the percentages by which these were talked about in the focus group. And from this research, we've seen and we hypothesized that in the Upper Hudson, these ecosystem services and their perceptions may be less. So this is something that I can apply to interviews, continuing on with this research. So with that, I'd like to conclude. I'd like to thank, this is not an exhaustive list. I've had so many people helping with this effort, including students at ESF. And I do want to give a really quick shout out. I am looking for interview participants for my last dissertation chapter so I can actually graduate in the spring. So I'd like to capture some of these voices we weren't able to in our workshops. So if you know someone who owns a dam or you own a dam on the Hudson River, please email me. I have a series of a quick couple interview questions. We don't have to do it over Zoom. We can talk on the phone. And I just like to further capture and obtain as much information as I can before I finish with this dissertation work. So with that, I think I can take questions, and I think I'm going to leave it on the slide lane. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Kayla. That was an excellent presentation. And we'll go to questions now. If you can use the raised hand thing on your participants screen, or you can send me a message through the chat and I can read the message, or I can unmute you if you use the raise hand. And Paul, you can let me know if there's any questions from anybody on Facebook, and you can send them to me through chat and I'll read them. So if anybody has any questions, please go right ahead. Okay, John Garver, I'm gonna unmute.
Yeah, Kayla, thanks so much. It was really interesting talk. As you probably know, I have a Mohawk perspective, and one of the things that I've been sort of thinking through is fish passage in the Mohawk, because it appears that eels are getting in there, and it also appears that the river herring are in fact invasive, and so if they get in, it's almost like a bonus. But my guess is that if you ask most people in the Mohawk about dams, I think dam safety and dam break in flooding becomes absolutely at the foremost of the discussion. And I know that that's actually less of an issue down in the Hudson. So it's almost as if there's sort of two different worlds that you're transversing in this discussion. And so can you make a comment about the importance, or what you've run into about the importance of dam safety and dam break actually during big flood events? You know, in Irene, we probably lost 6 dams and it was been quite serious.
Right. No, I think that's an excellent point, John. Thank you for your question. So with my recruiting for the Mohawk workshops, I definitely used the same type of methods that I did in the Hudson, which let's talk about fish. Come, let's talk about fish. And I don't think that was the right way to go about that at all. Absolutely. During our mediated modeling workshop in the Hudson, we did have someone from the New York Dam Safety Office come and give a presentation. And yeah, definitely their opinion was if there are unsafe dams out there, it would be one less that we have to worry about. So please take them out. And if there's ways to do that, we want to be on board. So what I think I'm going to have to end up doing with the Mohawk, I still have a little bit of time to finish this up. I'd like to do some what we call key informant interviews, and pick some. I have a list of some stakeholders that individually I'll be reaching out to and trying to obtain that information. Because absolutely, we tried to do a field trip in the Mohawk and we didn't catch a single fish in the Quassaick Creek, electrofishing. And I know Karin can speak to, she would love to catch and observe an eel in the Mohawk more than anyone. But I don't think some of our methods, even with her other projects, have been successful in that. So, and then also I want to add really quickly, with COVID this year, the canal system wasn't operating. So blueback herring weren't allowed to get into the Mohawk, from our understanding. So, what is that going to do to that cohort, that population from this past year for a species that's already really struggling? So.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Andrea?
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in on that, John. I mean, we didn't have the numbers at the workshop in the Mohawk, but the few participants that we did have did bring that up of flooding issues, and that if we were linking dams to, failing infrastructure, that we probably would have had a lot more participants. But it's one of those issues where, and it just kind of shows of all of the different systems that are interacting around this. We were talking about this in relation to fisheries, and they wanted to shift it to more of a structural question, and totally relevant. But I think that did impact it. But we got that message, and I think it's a very important one, because it links to climate change. We don't necessarily have to, say climate change. We could just say, structural integrity and, issues with the flooding. But it definitely came up as something that was a factor in people's perceptions of a need for dam removal.
Okay, thanks, Andrea. We have a question from Facebook Live. Why is New York State lagging behind other states in the Northeast on dam removal?
That's a really complicated question. I think a lot of it has to do with most of the dams are privately owned. So you need a motivated owner. Also, in terms of permitting, is very cumbersome. And the private dam owner would have to organize with a local environmental group to establish funding. They need to come up with their own funding, as well as a project like engineer to supervise the dam removal. So I know that Riverkeeper has been making some pretty good strides lately to get some dams removing is what I should say. But it's complicated. And I think looking to some other states or something that would be really valuable, like in maybe Pennsylvania or Massachusetts. And I hope to provide more of the solution side of things, answers, pretty shortly within the next few months.
Does New York have more barriers or regulations or paperwork or whatever compared to other Northeast states?
I know there's definitely issues with, you know, if you remove one dam upstream, it's going to impact like other stakeholders. So there's been a lot of conflict with that as well. They're all like interconnected in the system now. Also, there's a perception that there's sediments behind the dams that are very toxic. However, I know there's been some recent studies that have shown that the vast majority of dams in the Hudson watershed are not holding back sediments in the ways that should be scary if those were to get out in terms of what's accumulated in there. So I'm not an expert on those kinds of things, but that's what comes to mind.
All right, Karin, you have a question?
Not really a question, but more of a comment. I was out with I'm actually one of the few people teaching live at face-to-face at ESF this fall, and I have a fisheries practicum, and we were down in the Hudson last weekend sampling, and we didn't catch much in the way of blueback herring. One of the things that's a big question about the Mohawk is what is the role of the Mohawk for fishes that need to connect to the oceans. And this experiment this year, the COVID experiment of closing or keeping the Mohawk River shut down as a waterway for human traffic this spring, actually also prevented the migration, the annual spawning migration of blueback herring up there. And the dam, the lock operator at the Troy Dam, which is downstream of the Mohawk River dams and opens it to both the Mohawk and to the Upper Hudson, did let some spawning river herring migrate up into the Upper Hudson. So we know that there have been blueback herring observed up there this year. It's largely not so well understood how to use that system, but anecdotally anyway, it seems that there have been fewer blueback herring juveniles showing up later in the season as we would expect them to from the Mohawk. So there is I think there's probably, once the DEC gets their annual surveys all worked up for this year, I think it's going to be really interesting to see. And there is actually yet another conversation that it needs to go on, not only between the stakeholders like public citizens, but also within the DEC about the value of keeping that system open. So I think there is an upriver and downriver, upriver and downriver, or shall I say Mohawk and estuary differences of opinion from what I can tell. So that's kind of another thing, yet another layer on top of all this.
Thanks, Karin. I think Scott Cuppet had a comment real quick.
Real quick, actually, there was a question about why is New York State behind or something like that that someone put on Facebook. I just wanted to let you know that there is a new article that I just came across yesterday by, who was it, Research for the Future, the organization Resources for the Future. It's called Aligning Dam Removal and Dam Safety, Comparing Policies and Institutions Across States. And it is one of the better assessments or analyses of dam removal policy across states that are moving dam removal forward much quicker and better than New York State that I've seen. So I would encourage anyone interested in that question to find that article and take a look at it.
What publication is it in again?
Yeah, I put it in the chat there. Comparing policies and institutions across states.
Okay.
Aligning dam removal and dam safety. Comparing policies and institutions across states by Resources for the Future.
Okay.
Margaret Wells.
I'll find that and I'll send it to people.
All right, thanks. Good job, Kayla. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you,
Bye.
Scott. All right, we have another couple of questions from Facebook. What would the downside be of keeping river herring out of the Mohawk entirely? Anybody have a quick comment on that?
I can handle that.
Yeah.
Go,
I would
Karin.
say that's the $64,000 question, as they
Yep.
used to say. This is what I was alluding to. Really, it's blueback herring. And it's blueback herring as opposed to blueback and alewife, largely because the locks are operated during the spawning run of blueback herring when shad and alewife have already pretty much stopped their spawning runs. So the blueback herring comes later, a little bit later in the season. Personally, I think, I think we don't have enough hard evidence of this, shall we say, importance to the population for the entire watershed. But I think there are mixes of opinions about this. I see the Mohawk as a tremendously productive system. I've been floored when I've gone up there and done some scientific collecting for fishes, and just in terms of the amount of habitat and the number of young fish that you see, it's amazing compared to the Hudson. Some of the folks in the DEC and the estuaries program feel that if the Mohawk were shut down, then river herring would use the tributaries more of the Hudson. Maybe that's true. We don't really know. So it's really a tough question, but I think the insights from this year will be very helpful and will definitely spark a big discussion in late winter 2021. I have a feeling as we go forward to figure out, again, we'll probably reinvigorate the discussions we've been having on river herring in this watershed.
Okay, Andrea, do you still have a comment or question? Because your hand's up.
Oh, no, I just don't know how to unraise my hand.
Okay, I'll lower it. There we go, I'll lower it. All right. And then we have another question from Facebook. Are there any planned dam removals in addition to Quassaick Creek and Furnace Brook?
That would be a Scott Cuppet question.
And he had to leave. So is there a website, a DEC website on New York State dams, or is there a dams? I kind of thought I saw one. Is it a DEC
Yeah,
website?
I believe there is. Yep.
Okay. And some also Mark W said very few blueback herring use the upper Hudson for spawning. Does New York have more dams, more small dams compared to other Northeast states?
I don't know if I have the answer to that. Yeah,
I would say no. I think we're probably pretty representative.
Pretty representative, okay. I also have a question about the American eel. They can sort of like climb surfaces and kind of wiggle out of the water. Does that help them get around dams, that ability?
Yeah, if it's a completely vertical surface, they can't get up
Right.
that.
But
But
they can do pretty steep angles though, right?
Yep, and a lot of these older dams are actually built on waterfalls already. So the eels definitely would have gotten over that for sure.
And some of them can crawl around them, I think, if they're smaller dams.
Yeah, if it's like flooded, like wetland, marshy, there's been, yes, instances of that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, Pretty cool.
Yeah, they're cool creatures. Anybody else have any other questions or comments? This is your big chance. All right, well, Kayla, this was a really good and interesting presentation. Makes me miss the Hudson Valley. Maybe I can get up there and see some of these streams in the future. And anyone else, I encourage you to go and visit the Hudson Valley because it's really beautiful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kayla. Thank you, Karin. Thank you, Andrea. This was an interesting project, and it was a good presentation. We have a comment, just one more comment. They historically climbed the Cohoes Falls. They will also traverse around dams by moving through wet grass. So, yeah, I've seen videos about that with the eels moving through wet, and they're pretty good at that. So everybody, I would remind everyone to go and fill out the survey for the seminar, because that'll help us with our planning. I'm posting the link again. So after you leave, please fill out that survey, and thank you for attending. And we'll be keep an eye out for announcements for another seminar series in 2021. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.